In this video, we're going to talk about the differences in camera settings when it comes to shooting photos as opposed to shooting video. Hey guys, it's Erick with Inceptions Media. Welcome back to the channel and welcome to the video. So guys, just because you have a camera, that doesn't make you a professional. In order to be a professional, you have to actually take the time to really learn the settings and be able to adjust them on the fly in any given situation that you're in. In the last video, we talked about how to properly expose your camera using, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and white balance. If you guys haven't seen that video, please check it out. I'll put it somewhere here so you can go check that out first. So whether you're shooting photo or video, these settings are going to be very similar. Shutter speed is going to control the amount of motion blur you have in your image. Aperture is going to control your depth of field and how much things are in focus or completely blurred out. Your ISO is going to control your sensor's sensitivity to light. And your white balance is going to give you accurate colors in your camera. So when it comes to shooting photo and video, the biggest difference is your shutter speed. And this is because with video, you have something called frame rates that you need to think about. When you shoot photos, you really want to have sharp looking images. So in order to achieve this, you need to have your shutter speed higher. So depending on the situation that you're in, it could be as high as 1/2000, or it could even be as low as like 1/100. Just really depends on the situation you're in. If you're shooting fast-paced things, you obviously want to have your shutter speed higher so you can actually capture that moment in time. There is a rule of thumb though on how low you can put your shutter speed. So for example, say I have a 24mm. The minimum that I could go down would be 1/24. So you have the 1 over your lens focal length on the bottom, and that should be your minimum speed. This is obviously if you're shooting it handheld. This will really minimize the amount of motion blur you have when you're just shooting it handheld. Obviously you want to be way above that, but if you're in real low light situations, you have to be very careful. So if I'm shooting on an 85mm, for example, my minimum shutter speed will have to be 1/85. Or if I'm shooting on a 70-200, all the way at 200, then it'd be 1/200. There are instances though when I want to have my shutter speed pretty much be as slow as it can, which is typically around 30 seconds. And that's when I'm doing nighttime sky photography. So when you do this, it's gonna keep the shutter wide open, letting in all this information and all this light into your camera for 30 seconds. So it's gonna really be able to pull out what's in the darkness. But I only do this when I have a tripod stabilizing it. Otherwise, it's gonna be really shaky and it's gonna look terrible. So if you're gonna bump it lower than the 1 over your focal length or whatever, you should really have a tripod to keep it stabilized. That's really it when it comes to shooting photos. It's all about just exposing properly and be able to produce an actual good looking image. But now let's switch it to video. And when I mean switch to video, sometimes you actually might have to switch a dial on your camera into an actual video mode. Most cameras already just come in just the manual photo mode, but in order to properly shoot video, you gotta switch it into the manual mode. Otherwise, you won't be able to switch some of the settings that we're gonna talk about in this video. So for me, shooting video is a little bit more complex because you have to worry about things such as frame rates and motion blur. So what are frame rates? Frame rates are basically the frequency at which you capture video in a given second. So there's 24 frames per second that are used more in film and movies and stuff like that. There's 30 frames per second that's used more for TV broadcasting. There's 60 frames per second that's used more for sports broadcasting, and 120 frames per second that's used for just super slow motion stuff, right? And there's more beyond that that's used for super slow motion, so like super slow-mo stuff. But these are like the main kind of 4 that are used. Another way to think about frame rates is think of them as pictures in a given time. So if there's 24 frames per second, then you have 24 pictures in that second. And if you have 60 frames per second, then there's 60 pictures in that second. So there's a lot more information in the 60 or 120 frames per second that you can essentially extend out to create super slow motion or just have really super smooth footage, because you do have 60 of those pictures that capture every little move, which has to be a lot more smooth than 24 frames. The 2 main ones that I use is 24 frames per second and 60 frames per second. The reason that 24 frames per second is used a lot for film and movies and stuff like that is because it's the most natural looking. They say that that's the closest that our eye refreshes at, so it's gonna be the most natural looking in terms of like motion blur and stuff like that. And the reason that I use 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second is because there's a lot more information in that 1 second. So when I take it into the editing room, I can extend that over a longer period of time. So as I said before, the biggest difference with photos and video is your shutter speed. So once we have our frame rate, then we can determine our shutter speed, because you typically want to have your shutter speed be at least double your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames, you want to have your shutter speed be at least 1/48. Or there's no 1/48, so the closest thing would be 1/50. If you're shooting 30 frames a second, same thing, it's gonna be 1/60. If you're shooting 60 frames, then you want your shutter speed to be 1/120 or 1/125, and so on. So the first step when you're shooting video is you kind of have to know what frame rate you want to shoot at, and then you'll adjust your other settings accordingly. To start off, I would just suggest using 24 frames just to get the feel for it, and pretty much be able to film most things. It's not until you want to actually get a little bit more creative and use a little bit of slow motion here and there that I would suggest using the other ones. But to start off, I really just suggest using the 24 frames per second. So once we have our frame rate selected and our shutter speed kind of adjusted to reflect that, the other settings are really just there to help you expose properly. So that whether that means bumping your ISO up or bumping it all the way down, closing your aperture down or opening it back up, that's really up to you and how it'll look in camera. But for the most part, that kind of plays the same as shooting photos. Once you got your frame rate and your shutter speed kind of in tune, then it's really all about just creating a good looking image. Just remember to adjust the other settings and not your shutter speed. So if you go from like inside really dark, you probably have your ISO a lot higher, your aperture wide open, and you go outside, for example, then you're gonna have to like stop down your ISO, get that all the way down, probably even close down your aperture. But one thing you do have to keep track of is your shutter speed. You can't let it go below 1/50 if you're shooting 24 frames. But there are situations where you can go even higher than that. So for example, if you're shooting outside and you have your ISO all the way down, you wanna have that shallow depth of field, which means you have the background blurred out. So you have your aperture wide open and it's still really overexposed, then that would be a time that it's okay to, you know, crank your shutter speed to be able to bring that exposure to where you want it. Also, this would be if you didn't have a variable ND filter, which is ideal, but if you don't have one on hand, then that would be a time to bump up that shutter speed. So there you have it, guys, your photo versus video camera settings. The biggest difference in between these two is your shutter speed, because when it comes to video, you have to worry about frame rates. You have to figure out that first before you get into adjusting your shutter speed. And let me know your experience using these settings down in the comments. So if you guys liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified every single time we got a new video up, because we're trying to drop one of these every single week to be able to help you guys improve your skills. But that's all for me. I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.